Hello everyone, wise, wonderful people. Hopefully we're all becoming wiser with every passing interview, monologue and Q&A session. It's a conversation now. Today's guest says he is, and he is, on a mission to save lives with real evidence-based medicine and real food. He's a doctor, he's a cardiologist, so he specialises in the heart, and he's also been a fearless campaigner. But before we get started, I just want to give you a quick reminder to check out my patreon.com site. If you sign up there and spend about as much as a cup of coffee every month, you'll keep the wheels on the wagon and enable this podcast channel to keep going. You get early access to new content and exclusive access to a question and answer session every week. It's great. So join up, stir yourself into the mix and thereby make it better. Okay? Now it's time for this week's interview. Hi everyone, time for another conversation with a useful, informative, inspirational voice. Today's guest is Dr. Aseem Malhotra. I'm sure he's familiar to a lot of you, but maybe not to all of you. He's a cardiologist, so a heart doctor, also a health campaigner of many years standing, trying to better educate all of us about what we should be doing in terms of the things we're putting in our bodies. He's been on a whole fascinating journey. I very much feel a bond with Aseem because for me, someone who was very much approved of by at least part of the establishment, but has since found himself cast out into perdition for having had the temerity to have an opinion. But we'll get into all of that. So good morning. I'm not sure if it's morning where you are, Dr. Aseem Malhotra.
Morning, Neil. Lovely to see you. Yeah, it's morning. It's about just after 6:30 a.m. in Washington, D.C. at the moment where I am.
It's a bit of an overused term, I know, to say that you've been on a journey. But I feel it very strongly in connection with you. For me, people are often criticised for having come from a point of view and then read something, seen something and changed their point of view. And that, to me, is the path of someone really making sense of what it is to be human and alive, learning as you go. But you've had that experience, have you not?
Absolutely. I mean, actually, it reminds me straight away of a quote from Sigmund Freud. The surest indication of sanity is the ability to change one's mind. So those people that aren't changing their mind potentially are insane. Maybe we'll just throw that back out at them. I think when it comes to medical science, you have to acknowledge that it's constantly evolving. You're taught in medical school. I mean, Professor David Sackett, considered the father of the evidence-based medicine movement. And this is actually proven to be correct with data. He said half of what you learn in medical school will turn out to be either outdated or dead wrong within 5 years of your graduation. The trouble is nobody can tell you which half. So you have to learn on your own. And what is that purpose of that learning for me as a doctor, and probably for most people, maybe they don't realize it, is really to try and be the best version of oneself. As a doctor, my primary purpose is to improve patient outcomes, which means managing risk factors for disease, treating illness, and last but not least, relieving suffering. And suffering actually has a broad definition. It isn't just about loss and pain, which all of us are going to experience at some point in our life. It is actually, when you look at it from a more spiritual perspective, I've become very much aligned with Buddhist teachings in the last few years, considering all the different things that have happened to me that have given me strength. The broad definition of suffering is basic unsatisfactoriness with daily living. So for me, that is really the purpose of self-development, self-growth, and then dissemination of the information that comes to me for the purposes of helping others. That's really what drives me, Neil, more than anything else.
When I said you were approved of by the establishment, I mean, it's very clear that you were. I mean, I think as recently as 2016, the Sunday Times had you as one of the 500 most influential, in a positive sense, one of the 500 most influential people. And that was because of the work that you had done to make people aware of sugar and the deleterious effects that it can have and does have on so many people's health. And that was such a I'm always touched by that, because that was such a simple thing, in essence, that you were simply addressing a common or garden everyday foodstuff and pointing out that maybe we should have a different view of sugar. And that enabled you to be regarded by many people as someone so helpful. And the fact that when you started to have other opinions about other things that we put into our body, that it all flipped upside down on you. And I wonder what that felt like. You know, you must have felt good at the time when you were being regarded that positively. How did it feel when it all turned upside down?
Neil, to be honest, the backlash actually was there from the very beginning, in different ways, maybe increased in terms of its extent and magnitude, ever since I started speaking out. And it's an interesting story. I'm glad you've raised this, because it's not something I've spoken about really properly before. But when I originally started my campaigning on the issue of obesity, it was the first thing I broke into the mainstream with was an article in the Observer newspaper in 2000, and it was early 2012, if I'm not wrong, or was it 2011? I can't remember now. And it was around that time. And it was basically me calling out the fact that in the middle of an obesity epidemic, why have we got, it was 2011 actually, why are we selling junk food to our patients in hospitals? Why are we giving bedbound patients who can't go to the shop? Why are there contracts with hospitals where they have to be given sugary drinks, crisps, and chocolates? I mean, it sounds crazy. And it still exists, to be honest, Neil. So I wrote an article in the Observer which was called I Mend Hearts, Then I See Our Hospital Serve Junk Food to My Patients. And it was after I'd met with Jamie Oliver and asked him to get involved in the campaign on hospital food, etc. So that's where things started. Then I did a report which headlined on BBC Newsnight 2012, just for the Olympic Games, saying why are the main sponsors of the London Olympic Games McDonald's, Coca-Cola, Heineken, and Cadbury's, right? The angry cardiologist. And interestingly, related to that, Neil, when I started my campaigning, I was asked to be part of a group called the Academy of Medical Royal College's Obesity Steering Group. Now, that essentially is the medical body that represents every doctor in the UK, all the Royal Colleges. The chair at the time was a gentleman called Professor Terence Stevenson, who, interestingly, Neil, by the way, we'll come round back to this, ended up becoming the chair of the General Medical Council. He was my mentor. He saw me as a junior doctor. They said, we need to have a junior doctor representative here. He felt that I, was a very good advocate for this message of house tackle obesity, looking at evidence. I then started writing for the British Medical Journal. And every time I did something, there was a bit of backlash, usually a blog or something in The Spectator or whatever, someone who was essentially linked or funded by the food industry that would attack me and say I'm talking rubbish, that sugar's harmful, I'm a quack, etc. So that all started, and I was starting to get my first impression of, okay, when you put your head above the parapet, you're going to get backlash, and that's fine, that's inevitable. So you kind of get used to it, if you like. Obviously, it's not nice when it first happens, but you're kind of like, okay, you kind of take a step back and realize it's actually a backhanded compliment. As soon as you start getting attacked, it means you're doing something meaningful. And then that just gradually increased over time. And I think the biggest and the hardest situation I had to deal with at the time was when I wrote an article in the BMJ at the end of 2013 saying saturated fat basically doesn't cause heart disease. We've overprescribed statins to millions of people. Cholesterol is probably not a major risk factor. So imagine I'm taking on challenging lots of indoctrinated medical dogma. Okay, that's going to have its own challenges. Peer-reviewed piece in the BMJ, by the way. The first piece I'd wrote about, 8 months earlier in May 2013, basically doing my own investigation to sugar, Neil, and finding out through my own investigation that the sugar guidelines had been influenced by the sugar industry, that the Brits and Europeans were being told to actually eat 22.5 teaspoons of sugar a day. And I basically explained how this has happened and what the evidence tells us. I was on BBC Breakfast with Susanna Reid and Bill Turnbull at the time. It hit, I think, the Daily Express in the news there. And then, the sugar industry basically then had probably a targeted campaign against me. I had someone very senior who I think was linked to Coca-Cola and said that, Aseem, we've had a meeting in Europe just to warn you, because I like what you're doing. I think you're on the right track. You are their number one target in Europe. And then what that means is you're the number one critic, so you're going to be the one that they go for. in terms of smearing, not going to physically harm me or anything like that, but just smearing me online. You know, that rather than shoot me directly, they'd shoot me. That it's much better to shoot me online. So I was prepared for all of that. And then the BMJ piece, I think, took things to another level because of the statin issue. Up to that point, Neil, probably the most lucrative drug in the history of medicine, $1 trillion industry, prescribed to hundreds of millions of people worldwide. And the chief, if you like, the lead scientist who had got his knighthood on the back of that, his statin research, suggesting more people should take statins. And it wasn't declared in any of the news articles that his institution had taken, I think, over £200 million at Oxford from drug companies that manufacture statins. He essentially went to the media after going to the BMJ editor saying you need to retract this piece. And she said, no, we'll give you a right of reply. He didn't take that up for whatever reason. And then suddenly I'm in the media spotlight, having created world news saying that saturated fat isn't the major issue. Suddenly now, main BBC headlines, Guardian front page, myself and a guy called John Abramson from Harvard, who'd written an article on the overprescription of statins in the same issue as me, and said the side effects were essentially much higher than what doctors were being told. We were both basically then sort of ultimately we were on trial because the BMJ were put under pressure to retract the articles. They sent it for an independent review. For 2 months, I was effectively on trial because if there was a retraction, that's essentially career ending. And he was saying that what we had done, Neil, was worse than what Andrew Wakefield had done in relation to suggesting that there's a link between the MMR vaccine and autism. We won't go there right now because that's another interesting area as well. But that's what he was trying to do. And in the end, we came out 6-0 in our favor. The independent panel said there was no reason for retraction. There was a so-called error in terms of the reference we had used and the quality of the data behind what we'd made this case about 20% side effect risk. And that was corrected, if you like. And then we carried on. And for me, that was probably the hardest moment in my career where I really thought things were potentially could go, very much downhill from me. But it gave me a thick skin. And I didn't stop. And then I started campaigning more and more to highlight the issue of lack of informed consent with the prescription of statins and other drugs. And actually, Neil, during all this time, the Terence Stevenson, chair of the Academy, he stood by me. That tells you there's a lot of good people out there. The other person that came out of the woodwork when I started writing about this stuff and things about so many campaigning issues I've dealt with, whether it's also heart stents. I trained as an interventional cardiologist. If you're not having a heart attack, stents don't prolong life or prevent heart attacks. That was also a big deal, and that became a news story. And he wrote to me, Sir Richard Thompson, personal physician to the Queen of England for many years, past President Royal College of Physicians. He was a Royal College of Physicians president at the time, saying, Aseem, actually what you're writing is really good. We need to talk. He became a very powerful ally. So there are people within the establishment that very much agreed with what I was saying. At the very least said what Aseem says needs to be discussed. And I actually then managed to coordinate a campaign, Neil, because I realized we need a lot more of the medical establishment on board to deal with this. I coordinated a campaign called Choosing Wisely between the British Medical Journal and the Medical Royal Colleges. I was lead author in a BMJ piece in 2015 to wind back the harms of too much medicine. And that became it was ITV News, it was BBC News, it was front page of several British newspapers. I was the lead author on that paper. My co-author was the new chair of the GMC, the new chair of the Academy of Medical Royal Colleges. So I was with them all. But interestingly, over time, what happened is because of the impact of that, because I was the face of it and sort of the lead voice for it, behind the scenes, and of course that comes out in the film, which I know you've seen recently, First in a Pharm. They basically got to the new chair of the Medical Royal Colleges sort of indirectly. Almost certainly, I think it was people linked to Big Pharma to basically get me removed from that organization, suggesting that I was pushing my own agenda on statins, when actually what I wrote and what hit the news was actually co-authored with the former chair in a peer-reviewed journal. So that, for example, for me, Neil, that was, what I have done since then, and you say for some sections of the medical establishment, I'm a pariah, right? But what I've done is just been consistent to something which has become very controversial, Neil. This is all I talk about this in all my patient letters. It's called the practice of ethical evidence-based medicine. That's all I'm doing. That's all I'm doing to the best of my ability. And that's my area of expertise. I've got a background there. And I think that's where there's a challenge, because rather than being part of an organization now, I'm essentially doing it on my own.
What you've so neatly summarised and encapsulated there is the trajectory about you that fascinates me, because you started out talking about sugar and obesity and therefore food. Now, we all have our suspicions about the way in which massive food corps like Coca-Cola and McDonald's and so on go about the business of making profit. You can well understand and imagine that there might be a grey area there where the people involved might not really have the health of nations as their preeminent concern. But then you were starting to talk about statins, trillion-dollar industry prescribed to hundreds of millions of people, taken every day, and so on and so on. Obviously, that then gets into big medicine and big pharma and the medical profession in its entirety. And I suppose really what I'm asking is, in your opinion, who or what do doctors, the majority of doctors, serve now? Say in this country, maybe in the US. Are they like you, seeking to, are they in search of and serving better outcomes for the patients, or are the majority of them serving something else?
I think in their own minds, they genuinely believe and are well-intentioned and they want to serve patients. The problem is they don't realize that the information that they use to make decisions for patients on drugs, on tests, on surgical operations, but more than anything on medications, has been corrupted. So medical knowledge has come under commercial control, but most doctors don't know that. So indirectly, they are serving the interests of big pharma more than they are patients. That's the major issue. But
why would that be, Aseem? I mean, we are by definition the sort of people that make it into medical school. They're smart people.
Yeah.
By some metrics, they're very smart people.
Yeah.
You would expect them to have inquiring minds.
Yeah.
Why is that group of smart, qualified people so susceptible to corrupted information that people like me look at and think simply, I'm not sure about that?
Yeah. So intelligence and critical thinking aren't necessarily correlated. We evolved as human beings to use our intelligence more for our personal benefit, belong to a tribe, more than to actually search for objective truth. So that's just kind of putting that concept out there. There are lots of factors, Neil. One is the way that we are trained in medical school actually is to be more biomedical technicians rather than healers. What do you mean by that? What do you mean by biomedical technician? So one of the problems in medicine, in fact, this is a concept that a lot of doctors don't necessarily fully appreciate. Medicine itself is not an exact science, not even close. It's an applied science. It's a social science, a science of human beings. It's constantly evolving. It's not like physics or chemistry. Whereas most members of the public and many doctors don't even get that. They don't appreciate that. So we might learn that we're very good at learning about the human body and making diagnosis. So let me just go off on a slight tangent here. We're very good at diagnosing disease. We're excellent at that. We're taught to do that well. But what we are not good at, Neil, is understanding the root cause of a problem. We're not trained in the impact of lifestyle when it comes to people's health. And in fact, that probably is the most important aspect when it comes to trying to solve the current pandemic of chronic disease. And the third component, which is something I pushed very heavily when it comes to statins or whatever other drugs, we are not very good at understanding and communicating health statistics. In other words, true informed consent. So there's a massive gap within medicine and the approach to patients that ultimately means that we are not going to optimize their outcomes. And in fact, when it comes to information coming from the drug industry, often we're going to do more harm than good. And that is a major, major gap and major problem in medicine. So we learn about the human body, we learn about biology, we learn lots of facts, we learn about lots of diseases, rare diseases, but we're not being equipped now to deal with the current problems of today. And we're not also taught, Neil, talking about why do doctors not critically think? Well, I was one of those doctors that genuinely believed for many years that if something is published in the New England Journal of Medicine or the Lancet, it essentially is gospel truth. A drug works, a drug doesn't work. And therefore, it ends there. and you are taking the evidence and then you're implementing it with your patients, and you think this is called evidence-based medicine. But what doctors don't know still, and this comes out in the film, of course, is that, and it's quite shocking for a lot of people, and it will be shocking for doctors, is that medical journals themselves are essentially businesses that are reliant on the pharmaceutical industry and are therefore biased towards publishing their, their drug trials. And you take a step back even further just to unpick all the layers. Okay, well, how reliable is that data that's coming from them? And we know now that it's never independently evaluated at all. That's the major problem. So we go to the root of the problem, is that medical research is rarely independently evaluated. And the interest of the people who are producing that so-called research is purely there to make money. In fact, it's beyond that. It's pathologically self-interested. And Joel Bakan, law professor and forensic psychologist, predominantly Robert Hare, behind the original definition of psychopath, said 20 years ago in the documentary in the book The Corporation, that as entities, as legal entities, big corporations, including Big Pharma, actually fulfill all the criteria for the definition of psychopath. So let's just define that briefly. Callous unconcern for the safety of others, incapacity to experience guilt, repeated lying and conning others for profit. And if you look historically at the facts that we know, billions of dollars of fines have been paid by most of the top 10 drug companies over the last 20 years for illegal marketing of drugs, hiding data on harms, for example. So once you put all of that together, those bits of the jigsaw, the picture that it paints of our healthcare system is very, very ugly, Neil. And all of the current policies coming from whether it was Conservative Party in government before and the Labour Party, no one is addressing the root cause of the problem head on, which is until we correct commercial distortions of the scientific evidence, we will not be able to fix healthcare or the NHS.
It's a fantastic psychopathic business model when you think that because the profits are so vast,
yeah,
the big pharma has adopted a mindset that we can cause harm that gets picked up on and for which we are convicted, but the fines we'll have to pay are dwarfed by the profits that we've made anyway by pushing out the product.
Yeah.
No one's ever going to stop that.
It's a cost of business.
Oh, well, how much do I owe this week? Oh, that much. Oh, that's fine. The loose change from my dressing gown pocket will cover that. And I'll just go about continuing to harvest many thousands of times that amount of money by pushing out the thing that I've been, convicted of causing harm with.
Absolutely. And there are people that are aware of this because I obviously talk to a lot of people, I give lectures, etc. And I speak to politicians. I believe ultimately it does need changes in the law. That effectively the economic system has created this, Neil. One of the things that people are shocked by as well, when you go back to the root cause, when did this all really start? And of course, you can argue over centuries you've had, in many ways, a colonialist type thinking, in very simple terms, exploitation of groups of people or human beings or certain social classes for the purposes of making money. And that's been going on for centuries. We had probably a leveling up in the world, after the Second World War, and things started to improve. And then you see a reemergence of this pathological corporate type power mindset that in many ways probably led to the assassination of, we're not going to get down that route now, but probably led to the assassination of the likes of JFK and then his brother, Robert Kennedy Jr., who realized what was going on and wanted to stop it. And that's essentially concerned about American imperialism rooted in the corporatization America was formed on anti-colonial sentiment, right? It's now come full circle. American imperialism is now a culture across the world that is no longer transnational, but is happening within borders. So the people who are being exploited are actually the middle class and the working class. And the people who are exploiting them are a very rich elite who have benefited from a system that has been corrupted from the get-go. So I speak to people, I speak to politicians. So the reason I'm making this point is when this started happening, how did they get so much power? It was actually from probably, let's argue, well-intentioned policies introduced by the likes of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher to so-called deregulate industry for the purpose of thinking that we'll get greater innovation and there'll be a trickle-down effect because they'll make a lot more money Maybe they'll pay more taxes because they make a lot more money and they'll create more jobs. But actually what's happened as a result, when you look at Big Pharma, it's allowed them to have more power than ever, to the extent where politicians now who I speak to are too afraid. I won't name them, but they're very prominent people that come to me for medical advice quite often, or want to hear what I've got to say. And they think that this corporate power, if you like, this tyranny is so large that they alone cannot do it. And you've seen what happened to Andrew Bridgen when he called out the issue on the COVID vaccine, and he got absolutely destroyed. And they are afraid of that happening. I think, I've said this in interviews before, the problem is bigger than any president or a prime minister. It needs strong leadership, though. So it needs to be a multi-pronged approach where we get the dissemination of this information to the masses through social media, through these conversations like we're having, ideally through the mainstream media, although they've captured a lot of mainstream media as well, because most people would find this unacceptable. And then the system will change. So what we need to keep doing, Neil, is just to get this information out repeatedly again and again and again to more people, and then we can change the system so that laws are introduced to protect the public from the excesses and manipulations of these industries.
Now, I had many reasons for wanting to talk to you today, but paramount was the film, which I've seen, which you're talking about. I know you're in Washington at the moment. You're in part publicising the film. First, Pharm with a PH. And I'll be honest with you, because I've been in conversation with you and other like-minded people, I've become aware of a lot of the content. But even at that, it's harrowing to watch. And for anybody coming to it who's only got a mainstream media, God help them, understanding of the world at large, it's chin on chest, mouth agape watching. So I suppose for a start, how did that film come about?
Yeah, so Neil, I had made co-produced a documentary before in 2016 called The Big Fat Fix, with the director and co-producer of this film as well. His name's Donal O'Neill. He's a former Irish international athlete, and his documentaries that he's made are all about health and performance, and he's done several. His first one was very successful, called Serial Killers, as in sugared cereal killers, right? So we've been in contact. That, just very briefly, that original film we did, The Big Fat Fix, which many people wouldn't have heard of, but it was crowdfunded at the time because we wanted to keep it free from commercial influence. And it got featured in the New York Times, and it made BBC World News to try and question the understanding of the Mediterranean diet, and actually saying there's a better way, and how do people live long? What is truly, a healthful diet? How do you combat heart disease? All those things. And that did very well from an impact perspective because it premiered in the British Parliament. Tom Watson, the former deputy leader of the Labour Party, watched it, and he lost 100 pounds following that diet plan. We wrote a book called The Pioppi Diet, became an international bestseller on the back of that. So there was a lot of impact from that film, even though people haven't heard of it. And because I'm trying to change policy as well, anything I was going to do after that would be, twofold. Hit the masses if we can, but also hit policymakers. I was in South Africa at the beginning of last year on a speaking tour, interestingly invited by a man who I've become very good friends with, Neil, who you've seen in the documentary, Jay Naidoo. And Jay is, he was in Nelson Mandela's cabinet. He's a trade union leader. He organized a strike of 1 million people that forced the South African government to release Mandela from prison. He was his best friend.
I've had Jay on GB News.
Of course, absolutely.
And I've listened to his voice on Twitter Space, X Spaces, and all of the rest of it.
Yeah,
he's another significant voice. To put
a remarkable man. So he reached out to me and said, and this interestingly was in relation to all of my advocacy on trying to get the greater truth out on the COVID vaccines. And he said, you must come to South Africa. People need to hear your voice here. So I reached out to Donal, my co-producer, who lives in South Africa, and I went to stay with him. And he saw one of my lectures early on. And at the end of the lecture, and a lot of people say this because my lectures can be quite long, he said, there's a movie here. This is a movie. He said, your lecture is a film. It's a movie. And within a couple of days, he said, I've got the title, First Do No Pharm. I said, let's do it. And that's how it started off. And of course, what people see, interestingly, in the documentary is only about 15% of the filming and the footage. There was a lot of stuff. We you know how it is with editing. You just have to decide and pick what's going to be the best material for that time. But there's a lot of material there. There's a lot more in my personal journey and all the backlash of different things I've done. But we decided in the end, they edited it, and I think they put something together which is really strong. And that's really how it happened. And the plan then again was from my perspective was, let me hit policymakers as well. We had the US premiere in Capitol Hill hosted by Senator Ron Johnson. And then, you know, we've had some decent pickup. We had an Odeon Leicester Square screening, which was full.
Amazing in itself that you got the Odeon. I mean, God, well, you know, fair play to Odeon.
It almost didn't happen because something happened behind the scenes, which I won't elaborate on too much. But there was a suggestion, I think, from people that someone linked to Big Pharma tried to get it pulled so that it was going to, you know, be an embarrassment. But we managed to get it over the line. I think somebody within the Odeon was actually very sympathetic to the message. And they watched it as well to approve it beforehand. And they thought, you know what, there's nothing, we don't see anything wrong with this. So we got that premiere. We got some major, reasonably big names there, public figures from the likes of Annabelle Croft, Anthea Turner, Holly Candy. You know, and in the end, a friend of mine who is actually runs a very successful PR company who, you know, helped us out at a reasonable cost of, because we have to put all our money into obviously paying for the whole event. He was absolutely shocked that this didn't even hit any of the news. We had a very strong press release. We had, you know, and what's happened, this is an interesting point since then, is there's massive shadow banning going on, which people think is another layer unprecedented, where even sharing a photograph of celebrities that attended is on Facebook being removed, saying it breaches community standards of just attending this film. Nothing mentioned about the content or anything else. So that tells you just how, in my view, how worried Big Pharma are about this movie. They do not want you to see this.
That kind of tactic is so redolent of, you know, what went on in, you know, the Soviet and, you know, and in the novels of Kafka and Orwell. You know, the idea that guilt by association is so sinister. The getting into people's minds that if they are seen standing waiting to go in and see this film, that makes them bad people.
Yeah.
You know, the sort of people whose images then subsequently, you know, erased from the photographic record as though they had never been.
Yeah,
that is where we are in relation to something that has at its heart, as you put it earlier on, the determination to get good outcomes for people who aren't well.
Yeah, and just to give you an example of that, Neil, we've been here before, so it's quite interesting. One of the people that came to the premiere, who's a well-known TV presenter, said to me, Aseem, I've got to tell you a story. I was going on a show tomorrow, a mainstream broadcaster, as in, you know, the day after the premiere. There was some sort of conversation that needed to be had before going on the show with one of the presenters who's well-known. And she said to this woman, I can't speak tonight. I'm actually going down to the premiere of Aseem Malhotra's new film, First Dinner Pharm. The response from the presenter said, what do you mean? The conspiracist, the conspiracy theorist guy. She was so annoyed. She basically said, I can't believe you just said that. And because of that, I'm not going to come on your show tomorrow, right? So good for her. But the question is, where does that come from? I've never met this person, by the way, who called me a conspiracy theorist. They have bought into a narrative that works, and that's why they do it, from the mainstream, that has painted me in many ways as being someone that is a bad actor, you know, not well-intentioned, exploiting people for attention, and whatever they want to use. If you look throughout history, there's a really good documentary, Neil, which I think everybody should watch. Very powerful. I've seen it several times. It's called King in the Wilderness. It's freely available on YouTube. And basically, it's about the last 2 years of Martin Luther King's life. And what many people don't know is that he was two things. One, he became one of the most hated men in America. By the way, this is a man, Neil, who already had the Nobel Peace Prize for his work on civil rights, right? Already had that. Why did he become one of the most hated men in America? He was one of the first public figures to speak out against the Vietnam War. The media turned on him, saying he was bordering on treason. He went into clinical depression, not because he couldn't deal with that backlash. It even affected his close friends and allies who turned on him because they bought into the narrative that was being fed through the mainstream media. Think about that. So when you hear these things, these stories and stuff, I kind of just, you know, you'd think it would be upsetting. And actually, it used to be a little bit, but I rise above it and say, you know what, this is all part of the game, part of the tactics. And we see how things play out over time is ultimately the truth comes out. And when people look back in history, they don't see Martin Luther King as a bad guy and, you know, whatever else. They think, you know, this guy was a significant, phenomenal figure in the history of the world. And I'm not doing it.
Even if he wasn't, I mean, the mere fact, if you take away everything, even if you take away civil rights, all these work, if you just can contemplate that someone saying, "I don't think the war in Vietnam is just,"
yeah,
and after all, this was a war that saw some millions of Southeast Asian people killed. Women, children, you know, those territories are paying the price for that to this day. If the only thing Martin Luther King had done was stand up and say, "I don't think that war's just," that he was excoriated and cast into outer darkness for that,
absolutely
would be a calumny worth recording.
100%. You know, there's a line he uses, say, "People are damning me for saying we shouldn't be killing little brown children in Vietnam," right? And that's all he was saying. Yes. And that's what happened. So I think there are lessons there. And I'm not looking for, the other thing that happens, you look historically, and Neil, I know you've been part of this. You've been a very strong advocate. We're not looking for people to later on say, "You know what, you were right, thank you very much," because that's just about an ego. And that doesn't happen, by the way. We shouldn't expect that. Things are going to evolve. People are going to get the full truth on the COVID vaccine, for example, and the fact that it should never probably be given to anybody in the first place, just because we know what the data tells us now, and likely what these drug companies hid, given their historical behavior in this regard to lots of drugs. We're not going to be thanked, and that's fine. It doesn't matter. We have to be greater than what we suffer, and we're doing things for the greater good that gives us meaning and purpose. And that's why we do what we do, Neil.
I'd like, before we move on from the topic of First to Do No Pharm, I'd like to, just for what it's worth, what struck me, given that I was familiar with a lot of what was being said, but apart from that, it was the fact that the style of it is so calm. It's delivered in a very low temperature way. There's no, flashing lights, hysterical voices.
Melodrama.
There's none of that kind of shock jock approach to it at all. It's just this amazingly measured rolling out of information, and also some of the faces that appear to provide content are unexpected, and you see the faces come up with their little Aston that says British Medical Journal or whatever, and you think, uh-oh, this is undeniable.
Yeah.
For me, the impact of it comes from the fact that it's just, I need to quietly tell you something you should know.
No, absolutely. I think that we deliberately, I think credit to that in the editing and with to Donal O'Neill, because I obviously was involved in all of the content in terms of the things that we need to cover. But putting that together in a story that is interesting, and powerful, that can really hit hearts and minds, is another talent and skill, and that really goes to Donal and also Sean Morris, who helped with the editing from in Australia. So Neil, that was also, I think the reason for that as well is that I also I see myself as a medium for a message, and the sum of my influences, and the people in there are people that have influenced me, who have very strong credibility and expertise, and we need to get their voices, included in the film. And I think it's very hard. I think, Neil, it's interesting. I'm sure it'll come at some point, and if it comes, it's probably going to be a misrepresentation of the film. It's very hard to criticize it in the sense that it's not just one person; it's several people. It's several different layers. This is really uncovering the truth behind Big Pharma in a way that I don't think's ever been done before, Neil, in a documentary.
Give a quick summary from, you're the expert, but I was, amongst many things, reasons people should see it, the NTT thing, the numbers needed to treat.
Yes.
In relation to statins, I found very digestible information. I got that in one, I often have to rewind things and listen again and think, what was that about? I got the NTT thing in one. Just give us a quick preview.
Yeah, so NNT's numbers needed to treat, and that actually it reveals how statistics have been misused for the purposes of marketing and exaggerating the benefit of a drug in the minds of doctors, and therefore in the way that patients receive information. And what the numbers needed to treat does, it actually breaks down. This is, by the way, this is still from unverified data. So even the results that have been of drug trials that have been manipulated to try and show an extra benefit, even they have been misrepresented, right? And what it shows is, for example, if you take a statin and you're somebody that is maybe at risk of a heart attack but hasn't had a heart attack or hasn't been diagnosed with a severe blockage, the benefit of a statin over a 5-year period, based upon trials conducted by the drug industry that hasn't been independently verified, so likely still an exaggeration, and that's why we need further data, only shows a 1% benefit. In other words, you have to treat 100 people for one person to get the benefit of it preventing a heart attack or stroke without prolonging your life. If you've had a heart attack, the benefits are slightly more, 1 in 39 in preventing another heart attack and 1 in 83 in actually saving your life or prolonging your life. And the purpose of that is that information, and that's what came from Choosing Wisely, by the way. So this is not even just my opinion. This was something that the Medical Royal Colleges put out in 2015, saying medical practice needs to change, medical training needs to change, so that every doctor is communicating these statistics for patients with the purposes of true informed consent and medical ethics. Think about that. That was 2015. That's there. People can look it up. It's not been retracted. It's in the BMJ. It's got all these other authors on the, in very prominent positions, and that still hasn't been implemented into clinical practice, Neil. Why? Because when patients are fully informed, they choose less treatments. And what does that mean? It means less money and less profits for the drug industry. It might even true informed consent taking place in the NHS in this way for all drugs, it would collapse the drug industry overnight. And they're not going to let that happen very easily.
Uh-huh. I'm sure, I know you'll have run across brother and sister Casey and Callie Means, who are now, they're now coming in the context of Robert Kennedy Jr. and the Trump campaign and so on and so on. But one of the many things that Casey has said that really got me was there's no more valuable commodity in the US, let's say, than a sick child.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh my God, where has the first to do no harm,
absolutely
ethical, treatment of people got to when you can say that?
Yeah, I would go beyond that, Neil. Actually, I would say that they actually are gonna. The way that disease is diagnosed is often related to thresholds of markers in the blood or certain correlation of symptoms, etc. The drug industry want to make people who are otherwise well, make them believe they're at risk or they're sicker than they are. And that's how they expand the use of their drugs. So we've seen that, for example, with the lowering of the thresholds for doctors to prescribe cholesterol-lowering drugs, for example, over the years, purely to expand the use of their drugs. And I debated, and in fact, this was also originally part of the filming, but it didn't come in the end. Maybe we'll use it as a separate bit later on for people to watch. I debated the CEO of AstraZeneca and the Cambridge University Union in 2019. And the motion that was put forward, and by the way, the BMJ asked me at that point, so the so-called pariah by 2019 is still being asked by the BMJ to be a good advocate and represent them, if you like. There was three versus three, and I was first up against the CEO of AstraZeneca on the motion they put forward, which was we need more new drugs, which in effect meant we need more people taking more drugs. So from a business model perspective, the ideal scenario, Neil, is to get children started on statins. In fact, there's been a news story only a few weeks ago saying, I think the Mail Online reported it, give 15-year-olds statins to slash heart attack rates. I actually predicted this. I said, this is going to happen next. I said this months ago. I said this well after the COVID vaccine had been rolled out, saying they're going to be seen as the heroes of saving the world, saving millions of lives from this COVID vaccine, which is basically false. I don't believe that's the case at all. I think it's complete and total nonsense. But the perception for many people is out there that they have done this. They're going to capitalize on that by now getting more people taking more drugs. And the ideal scenario is to get children or babies on drugs. And Neil, what they would do next, and this is why people need to stand up, is the next phase of manipulating the law is to then get to a situation where your child can't go to school unless they're taking a statin, right? from a business perspective,
what would be that? I mean, I can understand. You might be able to say that if you're carrying a communicable disease, you might make an argument about, in that way of, people are unclean and must be kept away. But you can't catch heart disease from somebody else. So what difference would it make if a child had taken a statin or not?
They'll do it from a perspective of they'd argue that the healthcare system is under so much threat from heart disease, by the way, fueled by ultra processed food, fueled by over medication of drugs that you don't need with side effects, and then a distraction from meaningful lifestyle changes. They'll do it on the basis that actually to protect the NHS, we need to reduce heart attack rates, and therefore we need to get statins in everybody.
Do you subscribe?
And therefore, if you don't do, you're selfish and you don't care about the NHS. If you don't get your kid on a statin, I mean, this is a kind of nonsense that might sound ridiculous now, but it wouldn't surprise me, Neil, if we carry on where we're going. That's what's going to happen next.
Do you subscribe to the suggestion that big food, big agri or whatever, big food works to make people from kids upwards ill, and that is in collusion with big pharma and, God forbid, the medical profession to then seek profit from those generations of sick people by giving them drugs that just treat symptoms and pay no mind whatsoever to dealing with underlying causes. I mean, do you subscribe to that level of corrupted collusion to just benefit from making people and keeping people sick?
No, I don't think so. I think it's an exploitation of human beings that occurs as a result of the original motivation from the food industry, which is to basically sell food and get people eating as much food as possible. It's the same thing. What they probably do though, Neil, is that they will, the food products that they market have been deliberately manipulated to get people to be potentially addicted to them, hyperpalatable, so they keep eating more food. And big tobacco did obviously that with the cigarettes. So, there's a very good documentation done by Kelly Brownell, professor of psychology, previously at Yale, which is called, it's a brilliant paper. In fact, that actually helped me in my advocacy taking on big sugar. And it's called Big Tobacco Played Dirty and Millions Died. How similar is big food? But the primary motive of the tobacco industry was to get people addicted so that they sell more products and et cetera, et cetera. Food industry is the same. The side effect, unfortunately, of getting people addicted to ultra-processed food is people then get sicker, right? And the food industry don't profit or benefit from people getting sicker, to be honest. Big Pharma do, of course, right? That's an opportunity for weight loss drugs like Ozempic, which we also cover in the film, and I think people will be shocked. That's the next biggest scandal, Neil. Ozempic, the so-called weight loss drug that has been a very brilliant PR campaign that's been launched in the mainstream media. I've got celebrity friends who have been on it and think they thought it was a wonder drug, and now they've come off it when they've seen this film and they've spoken to me. So that's what's happened. It's basically just all profit driven. But yes, indirectly, of course, for big pharma, the more people that have high blood pressure and type 2 diabetes, etc., it's a massive cash cow for them.
But I mean, it's at the very least being charitable. At most, it's a grey area, isn't it? That if the medical profession, doctors, whatever, health professionals are aware, as they must be, because I am, and I'm just a member of the general population, the tricks of addiction that were used to make billions from tobacco, once smoking became unfashionable, the same techniques of getting people addicted to food have been applied there. That psychological, that deliberate psychological manipulation of a population to make them do something that's bad for them.
Yes.
If the medical profession are aware, and some of them must be aware of that, as I say, as I am, as you are.
Yes.
Then that's collusion after the fact, surely. Absolutely. And then our duty, and this is the other problem, the other issue, is then people speaking out when they have that knowledge, and that's harder for people, right? So, Jordan Peterson talks about the fact that it's not safe to speak the truth, but if you take it rationally, it's less safe to not speak the truth. So we need more people who are aware to speak out and say this is unacceptable. I think the other thing to add into there, Neil, which is, and this is another reason why they're defined as psychopathic as entities, they simultaneously then launch a
PR campaign to get people arguing about things like personal responsibility. So I'm going to get you addicted to ultra-processed food. Addiction is the opposite of free will. But let's launch a campaign simultaneously to say the reason you're fat and sick is it's your fault, and it's because you're not doing enough exercise. In 2015, I wrote a paper which again became international news with the British Journal of Sports Medicine and had like 1 million downloads, which is unheard of in medical journal terms normally, with 2 sports scientists called It's Time to Bust the Myth of physical inactivity and obesity. You can't outrun a bad diet. And what we said in that, and it's very clear, when it comes to weight, listen, exercise is great for health. Let me undermine exercise. I'm an obsessive exerciser. But when it comes to weight, it has almost no impact. It's all what you eat. Guess who were behind that PR campaign about physical activity? Coca-Cola, McDonald's. So they will also simultaneously get people arguing about stuff that is not really the major issue to detract from what they are doing. And that's another element, in my view, of psychopathic behavior.
I'm aware of your time. I know that you've, as the medical professional that you are, you've got patients coming your way shortly. So I'm going to try and move towards concluding this, which I could talk to you about for another hour at least. I often think about the parable, if that's the right word, of the blind men and the elephant. This idea that, 3 blind men or whatever are taken into a room with an elephant, and one holds the trunk and one holds the tail and one holds its ear or something. And they start arguing bitterly with one another because each one believes fervently that they know what they're dealing with here. And obviously the message of the parable is that if they were all just to step back and understand that what they're dealing with are interconnected pieces that are all one thing, much larger, potentially much more dangerous than the individual elements that each one is prepared to, that's the hill that each one's prepared to die on.
Absolutely.
And I wonder, we're talking together today about health and about medicine. And I admit freely that I've been trying to nudge you in certain directions to see if you believe that there's malign intent or malice aforethought in any of it. But I do wonder at the extent to which what society needs is to pull back and to see that what has happened to corrupt food, medicine, pharma, that's not the totality of it by any stretch. It's something interconnected that is bedeviling and threatening society and the health of nations around the world. That we're not back far enough to see the scale of the thing we're dealing with.
Absolutely, 100%. And I think actually part of what's happened in terms of our culture is that we've corporatized, Neil, human beings, right? And what does that mean? Partly because of this system, we are placing greater value on materialism, image, status, wealth, than we are on our personal growth, on interconnection with other human beings, and giving back to the community. And that isn't just about an ideological stance or a spiritual stance. All of the evidence from psychology research shows that the more materialistic one is, the more mental health problems, the more physical health problems, etc. So actually, part of the solution to the problem, getting to the root cause as well, is a deep understanding that you can't be healthy and you can't have healthy society unless you have healthy values
and meaning.
Absolutely.
There's a chronic, a famine level shortage of meaning, I would suggest.
Yeah, 100%. It's an existential crisis. So we have to go back to the basics. What does it mean to be human on an individual level, on a societal level? But simultaneously, we need to introduce changes in the way that structural changes in society that are going to get us back to a place where, we can truly flourish, right? Yeah. And that's what we need. And we want to create environments where everyone can flourish. That's what Nelson Mandela said. He said, peace is not the absence of conflict. It's creating environments where everybody can flourish. Because we're all interconnected. I think there also needs to be a deep understanding there. We are all interconnected. And we can't be the best version of ourselves unless the person next to us is also the best version of themselves.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. The divisiveness that's at play out there at the moment, I would say the deliberately stoked sectarian divisiveness driving people against people. And you think, okay, maybe you do have problems with the people left and right, but look up. and ask yourself where the bigger problems are coming from.
Exactly.
But I'm minded of there's a Canadian anthropologist called Wade Davis who's fascinating to listen to about many things. I don't agree with him about everything, but he has some fantastic insights. And he says that, you were talking about you've taken something from Buddhism and you're drawing from other places, which is so important, because he says that the other peoples of the world are not failed attempts at being us. On the contrary, they are themselves unique answers to the fundamental question of what it means to be human and alive.
Yeah.
And I think that is critical. And also, we go for meals along the road to a restaurant just along the road, and it's got quotes and aphorisms up on the wall. And one of them that I look at every time is from Tolkien. And he says, if more people valued food, song and good cheer than hoarded gold, we would all be merrier. And I think that's absolutely right.
Absolutely.
It's fundamentals.
100%. A lot of the answers to today's problems actually come from likes of Tolkien or even ancient wisdom. If you look at the times of Buddha and Socrates and, even biblical teachings, we have progressed in the last 2,000 to 2,500 years technologically, but we've not progressed psychologically, Neil. And in fact, I would say we're actually regressing now psychologically. So a lot of the solutions to today's problems actually come from those ancient teachings, for sure.
For all that you've been through, the journey, I hate using that term, but there you go, the journey that you've been on, do you feel better? In every way that means, you've physically, emotionally, spiritually, what you've been through, the travails, the brickbats that you've been up against, do you feel better?
Well, there's different ways of answering that, Neil. I think what I do gives me meaning and purpose. I'm a very resilient person, I know that. But despite all of that, losing both my parents in a short space of time, the medical persecution, I live alone. I don't have any immediate emotional support. So it has been hard. And I've been battling, I'll say I've been battling depression, clinical depression for the last 1 year. It's mild. I'm not taking anything for it. I'm doing everything else I can, from meditation to trying to optimize my lifestyle even more than I already did. But yeah, I just, this work gives me meaning. I keep pushing it, but yeah, I'm not in the best place I could be, but I have hope that things will improve.
If more people knew, what you just said there, we're offered these figures to as pariah. We're offered these people to focus all sorts of free-floating anxiety, as Matthias Desmet would put it. If people only knew the reality that what the last several years have done to individuals, instead of just seeing people as conspiracy theorists or whatever, deniers, granny killers and the rest of it, if people just knew, take a single example of the toll that trying to do the right thing and be honest and tell the truth has taken on people. But you're on the path. You are on the path to a true human being.
Yeah, and we have to be greater than what we suffer. And I think on a positive side, there are lots of people around the world. I mean, I get stopped in the street, certainly in London, at least maybe once or twice a day, from just members of the public who are really grateful to what we're standing up for. And of course, that is nice to get that feedback, and it keeps you going. But ultimately, as I said before, one of my areas of interest is actually what are the factors that are most important to one's mental well-being. And the single most important factor from research, Neil, is actually having good quality relationships. There is a commentator in the movie that says, a doctor who says that he tells his patients the most important thing for you moving forward is making sure that you have someone that loves and cares for you and someone you love and care for. And those basics that's what we need to get the conversation back to, actually. Those real basic things that, are free, if you like, right? So powerful, but something we're not paying enough attention to. Our interconnection with others, good quality relationships. That's really where everything starts. You look at the blue zones around the world, these communities which have extra long life expectancy. They weren't particularly affluent. I went to one village in southern Italy called Pioppi, where the home of the Mediterranean diet. And what was the common denominator? Of course, no ultra-processed foods. That's a no-brainer, right? They were out in the sunshine. They weren't sedentary. But the common denominator across all these different communities, who had different diets, by the way, was a strong sense of looking after each other and a strong sense of community. So that's the secret.
Aseem, I genuinely mean this to be just, we've had conversations before, and I I feel so strongly that we need to continue with this, which is essentially just one long, broken up conversation.
Yeah.
But what you have to say, and that the example that you are of someone learning as they go and seeking to tell other people, give them the fruits of what they have learned on the way along the road. You're such a fine example of that. So please, let's continue this conversation. But for now, knowing that you have to get on with the business of seeking good outcomes for your patients, I can only say thank you so much, Dr. Aseem Malhotra.
Thank you, Neil.